You've been told California was built on gold rush dreams and pioneer spirit. You've heard stories about brave settlers chasing fortune in the Wild West. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Early California wasn't a land of opportunity for everyone. It was a brutal empire controlled by a tiny elite who owned everything, decided everything, and crushed anyone who threatened their power. While a handful of men dined on imported champagne and built mansions that rivaled European palaces, thousands of people, Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, Mexican families, poor whites, were worked to death in their fields, their mines, their factories. These weren't just hard times. This was systematic exploitation designed by the powerful to keep themselves on top and everyone else fighting for scraps. If you weren't born into the right family, if you didn't have the right skin color, if you didn't speak the right language, early California was a nightmare. You had no voice, no vote that mattered, no legal protection worth mentioning. The men who ran California didn't just ignore your suffering, they profited from it. They wrote the laws, they owned the courts. They controlled the land, the water, the jobs, the future. This isn't a story about everyone struggling together through tough times. This is a story about a rigged system where a few dozen families held all the cards while everyone else bled to make them richer. And for decades they got away with it because they could, because they owned California. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how deep that control went, how violently it was maintained, and how many lives it destroyed. This is the California they don't want you to remember. Let's go back to the 1850s through the early 1900s, right after California achieved statehood. On paper, this was supposed to be a fresh start, a new American state full of promise. But the reality? California was being carved up like a prize pig by men who had no intention of sharing. The landscape itself seemed designed to concentrate power. California wasn't some cozy collection of small farms where everyone had a fair shot. This was a massive territory with incredibly valuable resources: gold in the Sierra Nevada, fertile valleys that could feed millions, timber forests stretching for hundreds of miles, and eventually oil beneath the southern soil. Whoever controlled these resources controlled everything. And here's the crucial part you need to understand. By the time most ordinary people arrived hoping to build a life, the game was already over. The land had already been claimed, not by homesteaders working their own plots, but by massive land grants given to political insiders, by railroad companies who received millions of acres from the government, by wealthy speculators who bought up everything they could reach. The Big Four railroad barons, Leland Stanford, Collies Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, didn't just build a railroad, they built an empire. They controlled transportation, meaning they decided who could move goods and at what price. They owned townsite after townsite along their rail lines. They had politicians in their pockets at every level. When you shipped your grain, rode to the next town, or tried to start a business, you were paying them. Always them. In the Central Valley, land grants created massive estates, 50,000 acres, 100,000 acres, some even larger. These weren't farms. They were feudal kingdoms run by absentee landlords who hired foremen to extract maximum profit from the land and the people working it. If you wanted to farm in California, you weren't buying your own homestead. You were renting from a man you'd never meet, under terms he could change whenever he wanted. Down south, old Spanish and Mexican land grants, some legitimate, some fabricated, put hundreds of thousands of acres into the hands of a few families. These Californios and the Anglo speculators who married into their families or bought them out controlled everything from San Diego to Santa Barbara. The climate seemed beautiful if you were wealthy: Mediterranean sunshine, mild winters. But if you were poor, that same climate meant working in 110-degree fields with no shade, living in structures that baked you alive in summer, and watching crops fail when the powerful controlled the water and decided your farm wasn't important enough to irrigate. You need to picture this clearly. California in this era was a place where a few hundred men owned nearly everything worth owning, and they intended to keep it that way. They didn't need to seize power. They already had it. Now they just needed to maintain it, and they didn't care what that cost everyone else. If you weren't part of the elite, your daily life in early California was about survival, not prosperity. Let's start with where you lived, because your housing situation told the story of your place in the hierarchy. The wealthy built Victorian mansions on Nob Hill in San Francisco, sprawling haciendas in Southern California, and comfortable ranch houses on their vast estates. They had running water, multiple fireplaces, imported furniture, libraries, separate quarters for servants. If you were lucky enough to have work, you lived in whatever the landowner or company provided, which meant barely anything. Farm laborers lived in crude bunkhouses, sometimes just three-sided shacks with canvas for the fourth wall. Chinese railroad workers lived in tents or rough wooden barracks that flooded when it rained and baked when it did. In the agricultural valleys, entire families crowded into single-room shacks with dirt floors, gaps in the walls, and roofs that leaked every winter. San Francisco's working poor packed into overcrowded tenements in districts the wealthy never visited. Multiple families shared outdoor toilets. Garbage piled in alleys because the city only collected trash in nice neighborhoods. When fire swept through, and it did repeatedly, these districts burned fast because they were built cheap from scrap wood packed tight, with no fire protection worth mentioning. Hygiene wasn't about preference. It was about access. The powerful had indoor plumbing, private bathrooms, soap from Paris. You had a shared pump if you were fortunate, or you hauled water from a creek that probably had livestock upstream. Bathing meant heating water in a pot after a 12-hour workday if you had energy left. Most people went days or weeks between baths not because they didn't care, but because they were too exhausted and too poor to manage it. Your diet separated you immediately. The wealthy ate beef, fresh vegetables, fruit, bread from bakeries, imported delicacies. They had wine cellars and ice boxes. They never wondered where their next meal would come from. You ate whatever was cheap and filling: beans, rice, tortillas if you were Mexican, maybe salt pork if you could afford it, but often it was rancid because you had no refrigeration. Vegetables when they were in season and you could access them, but in many labor camps, fresh food was scarce. You ate to survive, not to enjoy. Malnutrition was standard. Children grew up stunted. Adults lost teeth early, suffered from diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies, and looked a decade older than their actual age. The California weather everyone celebrates. It was only pleasant if you had shelter and shade. If you were picking crops in the Central Valley in July, that sun wasn't romantic, it was deadly. Heat stroke killed workers every summer. No one stopped work for heat. You kept going until you collapsed, and if you collapsed, you lost your job. Winter might seem mild compared to the East, but when your housing had gaps in the walls and no real heat, when your clothes were threadbare and you couldn't afford more, when you worked in the rain because stopping meant no pay, those mild California winters made you sick. Pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis, they all thrived in damp, cold conditions where people were already weak from poor food and exhaustion. You never felt secure. The powerful lived behind gates with servants and security. You lived knowing that any disaster, illness, injury, job loss would destroy you. There was no safety net, no savings for people living on starvation wages, no help coming from a government run by, and for the wealthy, every single day was about making it to the next day. That's not pioneer spirit. That's desperation normalized. This is where the system revealed itself most clearly. The work available in early California wasn't hard because the frontier was tough. It was hard because the powerful designed it that way to maximize their profit and minimize their costs. Let's start with the gold mines, since that's what brought so many people to California. The early years of the gold rush let individual prospectors stake claims and work for themselves. But that window closed fast. By the mid-1850s, the easy surface gold was gone. What remained required industrial mining, hydraulic mining that blasted hillsides with water cannons, hard rock mining that went deep underground, dredging operations that needed expensive equipment. Guess who owned that equipment? Not you. The powerful bought up claims, consolidated operations, and hired wage laborers. And mining work was brutally dangerous. You went underground into poorly ventilated shafts that could collapse without warning or flood or fill with explosive gases. You breathed rock dust that destroyed your lungs. You worked with unstable dynamite. Cave-ins, explosions, and silicosis killed thousands of miners and the mine owners. They just hired replacements. Your life had no value beyond the ore you could extract, and the pay, barely enough to survive. The mining companies often paid in scrip, company money only good at the company store where prices were inflated. You fell into debt to your employer and they preferred it that way. Debt kept you working. Agriculture was even worse in some ways because it was endless. The massive estates needed armies of seasonal workers to plant and harvest, but the landowners never wanted to pay fair wages or provide decent conditions. Why would they? There was always someone more desperate willing to work for less, so they created a rotating system of exploitation. They brought in Chinese immigrants and paid them starvation wages, knowing they had no legal recourse. When white workers complained about competition, did the landowners raise wages for everyone? Of course not. They just played groups against each other, importing Japanese workers, Filipino workers, Mexican workers, whatever kept labor costs low and workers too divided to organize. You worked 12 to 14-hour days during harvest season. You were paid by the pound or the basket, not by the hour, so your pay depended on impossible speed. Fall behind and you got nothing. The landowner lost nothing. You absorbed all the risk of bad weather, crop failure, illness. There were no contracts protecting you. You could be fired instantly for any reason or no reason. Complain about conditions, fired. Ask for owed wages, fired. Try to organize other workers, fired and blacklisted so you couldn't get work anywhere in the region. The railroad companies were particularly vicious. Building the transcontinental railroad required thousands of workers doing incredibly dangerous work, blasting through mountains, working on cliffs, laying track in scorching deserts. Chinese workers were given the most dangerous jobs because the railroad owners considered them expendable. They were paid less than white workers for the same work, housed in worse conditions, and worked in winter conditions that white workers refused. When Chinese workers struck for equal pay and better treatment in 1867, Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, simply cut off their food supply until they went back to work. That's how the powerful responded to labor organizing. Starvation. Urban workers weren't much better off. Factory jobs, dock work, construction, all dangerous, all poorly paid. San Francisco's waterfront was controlled by shipping companies that worked with corrupt unions to control who got hired. If you weren't connected, you didn't work. If you were connected, you paid a piece of your wages to the boss who got you the job. Women's work options were even more limited and worse paid. Domestic service meant 18-hour days for room, board, and a pittance. Factory work in garment shops or canneries paid so little that women and children had to work together to afford rent and food. And sexual harassment wasn't a complaint you could file. It was just part of the deal. Child labor was everywhere. 10-year-olds worked in the fields and the canneries, selling newspapers on street corners. Wealthy families kept their children in school, preparing them to inherit power. Your children went to work because you couldn't survive on adult wages alone. The powerful weren't just wealthier than you. They were extracting wealth from your labor, your health, your life, and giving back just barely enough to keep you alive and working. When they looked at California's economy, they saw their empire growing. When you looked at the same economy, all you saw was another day of pain for another day's survival. In early California, the powerful could buy their way out of death. You couldn't. And that difference killed tens of thousands of ordinary people who never had to die. Let's be clear about what healthcare looked like. If you were wealthy, you had access to private doctors, sometimes trained in Europe. You could afford experimental treatments, extended rest cures, travel to healthier climates. You had clean homes, nutritious food, and time to recover from illness. Your children received vaccinations. When surgery was needed, you could pay for the best available. For everyone else, getting sick was a death sentence you had to watch unfold in slow motion. California in this era was disease-ridden. Cholera epidemics swept through crowded neighborhoods where sanitation didn't exist. Typhoid spread through contaminated water that poor communities had no choice but to drink. Smallpox, despite vaccination being available, killed hundreds because vaccines cost money and required access to doctors that working people didn't have. Tuberculosis, consumption, was everywhere. It thrived in the overcrowded tenements, the damp worker housing, the poorly ventilated bunkhouses where sick and healthy people slept side by side. Once you got TB, you died slowly, coughing blood wasting away, unable to work but unable to afford treatment. The wealthy could go to sanitariums. You just died at home while your family watched. Workplace injuries were constant and catastrophic. Mine collapses crushed men alive. Runaway rail cars severed limbs. Agricultural equipment, crude and unguarded, mangled hands and arms. Factory machinery caught clothing and hair, pulling workers into gears. And when you were injured, there was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no employer responsibility. You were just fired and replaced. If you were lucky, your family could care for you while you recovered, but that meant more mouths to feed with one fewer worker. If you weren't lucky, you died from infection because proper medical treatment was impossibly expensive. Amputation was the standard response to serious limb injuries, and it was done without anesthesia for many workers who couldn't afford it. Imagine understanding that your crushed leg needs to come off, knowing you'll be conscious for the whole procedure, and knowing that even if you survive, you're now unable to do physical labor and therefore unable to earn a living. Childbirth killed women at shocking rates. Wealthy women had doctors attend their births, access to somewhat cleaner conditions, and help afterward. Poor women had midwives if they were fortunate, and often just other women in the community with no training. They gave birth in the same unsanitary shacks where they lived, went back to work within days because they had no choice, and many died from infections, hemorrhages, or exhaustion. Infant mortality was staggering among the poor. Babies died from diseases that were preventable, from malnutrition, from accidents in overcrowded housing, from simple diarrhea that caused fatal dehydration. Wealthy families mourned rare infant deaths. Poor families expected to lose at least one or two children and considered themselves fortunate if more survived. The powerful had literally legislated themselves better health outcomes. Public health measures, clean water systems, sewer systems, garbage collection, street cleaning, were funded and implemented in wealthy neighborhoods first, sometimes exclusively. Nob Hill had clean streets and working sewers while the industrial districts flooded with human waste every winter. When epidemics hit, the powerful could leave. They had second homes, could travel, could isolate themselves. You stayed and hoped you'd survive. Quarantines were enforced in poor neighborhoods, entire districts blocked off, while the wealthy came and went freely. Pain was your constant companion. Dental care didn't exist for working people until your teeth literally rotted out of your head. Chronic conditions, arthritis from brutal labor, back injuries, hernias, went untreated because doctors cost money you didn't have. You just lived in pain, every day, working through it because stopping meant starvation. Death came early and often. Men died in their 40s, worn out from decades of brutal work. Women died even younger from the combined burden of labor and childbirth. The powerful built elaborate tombs and held grand funerals. Your family buried you in unmarked graves in potter's fields if they could afford burial at all. The wealthy saw old age. You probably wouldn't. That wasn't bad luck. That was the system working exactly as designed. Here's what they don't tell you about law and order in early California. The powerful created a legal system that protected their interests and punished everyone else. Justice wasn't blind, it was purchased. Let's start with the most obvious violence: vigilante justice. San Francisco's vigilance committees of the 1850s are sometimes romanticized as necessary citizens taking control when regular law failed. But look closer at who ran these committees and who they targeted. They were organized and led by merchants, businessmen, and the wealthy elite. And who did they hang? Immigrants, particularly Irish and Australian, and anyone who threatened business interests or property. These weren't mobs seeking justice. They were organized campaigns of terror designed to maintain social control. The powerful used vigilante violence to eliminate people they considered undesirable without bothering with messy things like trials or evidence. They hung people from buildings in public spectacles to send a message. We decide who belongs here and who dies. Regular law enforcement was completely corrupted by wealth and power. Sheriffs and judges were often owned by the railroad companies, the big landowners, or the San Francisco political machines. If you were poor and accused of stealing, you went to prison. If you were wealthy and accused of fraud, bribery, or even murder, you walked free. There are documented cases of landowners literally hiring gunmen to terrorize farmers and squatters off disputed land. These weren't isolated incidents, this was standard practice. The Mussel Slough Tragedy of 1880 is one famous example. Southern Pacific Railroad agents opened fire on farmers disputing land prices, killing 7 people. And who was prosecuted? The farmers who survived. The powerful used the legal system as a weapon. They would file lawsuits against small landowners, knowing that even if the landowner was completely in the right, the cost of defending themselves in court would bankrupt them. The wealthy could afford lawyers who dragged cases out for years. You couldn't, so you lost by default. Chinese immigrants faced organized, state-sanctioned violence. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was federal law, but California led the way with local ordinances designed to make Chinese life impossible. The powerful business owners who had imported Chinese labor to work cheaply now scapegoated them when white workers complained about wages. Chinese districts were raided by police on any pretext. Chinese miners were driven from claims by white mobs while law enforcement watched or participated. In Los Angeles in 1871, a white mob lynched 18 Chinese residents in one night. It's one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, and not a single person was convicted. Native Americans faced outright genocide with government support. California paid bounties for Native American scalps and body parts into the 1860s. State-sponsored militias and private parties hunted Native people like animals. Landowners who wanted Native Americans off valuable land could simply hire men to kill them. Thousands died. Their land became estates for the powerful. Mexican Californios who had legally owned land under Mexican law found themselves dispossessed through legal manipulation. Land grant hearings were conducted in English, required expensive lawyers, and dragged on so long that many families went bankrupt trying to prove ownership of land they'd held for generations. Meanwhile, Anglo speculators moved in, sometimes forging documents, always working with judges they'd bribed. Labor organizing was met with overwhelming violence. When workers tried to strike, the powerful called in private security forces, essentially armed thugs, to break strikes with clubs and guns. The Wheatland Hop Riot of 1913 started when farm workers, including women and children, struck for basic sanitation at a labor camp. The owner called in sheriff's deputies who opened fire on the crowd, killing 4 people including a district attorney who happened to be there. Urban crime was rampant, but the police only seemed motivated to solve crimes in wealthy neighborhoods. Get robbed on Nob Hill and detectives would work the case. Get robbed in Chinatown or south of Market Street and police barely filed a report. The powerful sometimes hired criminals for their own purposes. Need strikebreakers. Hire gang members. Need someone intimidated. Pay thugs to do it. Want a competitor's business burned down. That could be arranged. The corruption went so deep that organized crime and legitimate business were often indistinguishable. Women had virtually no legal protection. Domestic violence wasn't seriously prosecuted. Sexual assault of working-class women was rarely investigated. If a wealthy man assaulted a poor woman, she had no realistic path to justice. If she worked in his home or his business, reporting him meant losing her job and being blacklisted. The powerful lived behind private security while everyone else lived in fear. They created a system where violence protected their interests and punished anyone who challenged them, and they called it law and order. If early California was brutal for working men, it was absolutely devastating for everyone with even less power: women, children, and immigrants. These groups existed almost entirely at the mercy of the powerful, with virtually no legal rights and no realistic path to protection. Let's start with women, because California law treated them as property. If you were a married woman, you had no right to own property separately from your husband until 1850, and even then, enforcement was selective. Your wages belonged to your husband legally. You couldn't sign contracts, serve on juries, or vote. If your husband was violent, leaving him meant losing your children and whatever stability you had, choosing between abuse and destitution. Working-class women had almost no options that didn't involve exploitation. Domestic service was the most common employment, which meant living in your employer's home, working from dawn until late night, and being available every hour. Sexual harassment and assault by male employers was so common it was simply expected. Speak up, and you'd be fired with no reference, making it nearly impossible to find other work. Factory work paid starvation wages. Women in canneries stood for 12-hour shifts doing repetitive work that destroyed their hands. Garment workers sewed in poorly lit rooms that ruined their eyesight, racing to meet piece rate quotas. You were paid half or a third of what men earned for the same work, justified by the fiction that women were just working for extra money, not survival. Prostitution was often the highest paid work available to women without family support, and the powerful profited from that too. San Francisco's Barbary Coast was famous for vice, but the real money went to the property owners who rented to brothels, the political bosses who took protection payments, and the police who were paid to look the other way. The women themselves. They were arrested periodically for show, fined, and sent back to work. The system kept them desperate and criminalized while the powerful men who profited faced no consequences. Chinese women faced compounded horrors. Most Chinese women in early California were brought over under false pretenses and forced into prostitution. They were held in debt bondage, quite literally enslaved, and the powerful did nothing because they didn't consider Chinese people fully human. When reformers occasionally tried to rescue these women, property owners and madams sued to get them back, arguing they were stolen property. Children of the poor had no childhood. 10-year-olds worked full days in fields, in canneries, in factories. They sold newspapers on street corners, shined shoes, did whatever could bring in a few cents. California had no meaningful child labor laws until well into the 1900s, and even then, enforcement was selective. Wealthy families would be horrified at the thought of their children working, but they saw nothing wrong with employing other people's children for pennies. Education was theoretically available, but practically impossible for most working-class children. Public schools existed, but if your family needed your labor to survive, you didn't go. And even if you did attend briefly, schools were segregated and grossly unequal. Chinese children were barred from white schools and had to fight for decades just to access separate, inferior facilities. Mexican children faced the same discrimination. Native American children were sometimes forcibly taken to boarding schools designed to destroy their culture. The powerful sent their children to private academies and universities. Your children went to work. Immigrants faced systematic oppression that the powerful orchestrated deliberately. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't accidental racism. It was a calculated response by powerful interests who had used Chinese labor to build California and now wanted to prevent Chinese people from competing economically or bringing families to established communities. Immigration law was a tool of control. When the powerful needed labor, they encouraged immigration. When workers became too organized or demanding, they pushed for exclusion and deportation. This pattern repeated with every immigrant group: Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Mexican. They were welcomed when they could be exploited and expelled when they demanded dignity. Immigrant communities lived under constant threat. Raids, deportations, and violence were used strategically to keep people afraid and compliant. If you were Mexican, you might have been born in California when it was Mexico, but after 1850, you were treated as foreign. Your land could be taken, your language was suppressed, your culture was criminalized. Japanese immigrants faced increasingly harsh restrictions, culminating eventually in World War II internment. But the foundation was laid in this earlier period, when California began passing laws to prevent Japanese people from owning land, solely because Japanese farmers were successfully competing with white landowners. Filipino workers were brought in as agricultural labor specifically because they were colonial subjects, not foreign and not citizens, existing in legal limbo where they had no rights. The powerful could pay them almost nothing, house them in terrible conditions, and deport them if they complained. Women, children, and immigrants weren't just suffering alongside everyone else. They were the most exploited layers of an exploitative system. The powerful didn't just ignore their humanity, they built their fortunes by denying it. Every massive estate, every railroad fortune, every agricultural empire was constructed on the backs of people who had no power to refuse, no legal standing to fight back, and no hope that the system would ever protect them. If you had to pick the single darkest moment that revealed just how completely the powerful controlled California, it would be the 1870s through the 1890s, the decades when their grip became so complete that resistance seemed impossible, and the suffering reached a breaking point. This was the era when the railroad monopoly strangled California's economy. The Big Four didn't just control transportation. They controlled legislation through bribes, controlled media through ownership, and controlled local politics through puppet politicians. If you tried to ship grain and the railroad charged you more than your grain was worth, you had no alternative. You just lost everything. The Central Pacific and Southern Pacific Railroads had become so powerful that they decided elections, crushed reformers, and operated with complete impunity. When California tried to regulate railroad rates through a railroad commission, the railroad simply bought the commissioners. When newspapers criticized them, they withdrew advertising until the papers went bankrupt or fell in line. Farmers organized in desperation. The Grangers movement tried to create political pressure for reform. They documented how the railroad was destroying farm families, collected evidence of corruption, and pushed for change. And they were systematically destroyed. The powerful used every tool available: legal harassment, economic pressure, and ultimately violence. The 1880s brought brutal drought combined with economic depression. Crops failed across the Central Valley. Farmers who had barely survived in good years now faced complete ruin. Did the landowners reduce rents? Did the railroad reduce shipping rates? Of course not. They maintained their profits while everyone else starved. San Francisco filled with desperate unemployed workers. The city's poor districts became scenes of unimaginable misery. Families evicted from even the worst housing, children begging in the streets, disease spreading through overcrowded tenements. And the city's response, controlled by the powerful, increased police presence to keep the poor away from wealthy neighborhoods. This was when anti-Chinese violence reached fever pitch. White workers, suffering terribly themselves but unable to touch the powerful who actually controlled their fate, were redirected to blame Chinese immigrants, and the powerful encouraged this. Better to have working people fighting each other than organizing against the real enemy. Working-house conditions hit rock bottom. Agricultural labor camps were compared, even by witnesses of the era, to slave quarters. Workers lived in structures that barely qualified as shelter, were fed food that was borderline spoiled, and worked under threats of violence. Labor contractors functioned as slavers, controlling every aspect of workers' lives. The Mussel Slough Tragedy of 1880 crystallized everything. Farmers in the Central Valley had been promised they could buy land from the Southern Pacific Railroad at $250 an acre once they developed it. They spent years building irrigation, planting crops, making the land valuable. Then the railroad decided to sell it for $25 to $40 an acre instead. When farmers refused and sued, the railroad sent armed agents to evict them. 7 people died in the shootout. And what happened? The railroad faced no consequences. The surviving farmers were prosecuted. Newspapers owned by or dependent on the railroad portrayed the farmers as violent criminals. The powerful rewrote the narrative in real time, turning victims into villains. This era broke something in California's collective spirit. People began to accept that the powerful were untouchable. Reform movements lost momentum when leaders were bought off or destroyed. The message was clear: resistance is futile. The system exists to serve the powerful, and you exist to be exploited. Workers who tried to organize faced not just dismissal but blacklisting across entire industries. Troublemakers were marked, and no one would hire them. Some left California entirely. Others just gave up, accepting that this was simply how life would be: brutal, unfair, and hopeless. This is what made early California a playground for the powerful. It wasn't just that they had wealth and you did. It's that they had constructed a complete system, legal, economic, political, and social, that existed solely to maintain their dominance and your subjugation. And for decades it worked perfectly. Stop for a moment and think about your life right now. Whatever struggles you face today, whatever problems seem overwhelming, you need to understand how different your existence is from the people we've been discussing. You have labor laws. They're not perfect, but they exist. You can't be worked 18 hours a day without overtime. Children can't be sent to work in factories at age 10. Workplace safety regulations require employers to provide basic protection. When you're injured on the job, workers' compensation exists. None of this was inevitable. People fought and died to win these protections from the powerful who opposed every single reform. You have access to health care. Even if it's expensive, even if it's imperfect, you can get antibiotics for infections that would have killed you in 1880. You can have surgery with anesthesia. Tuberculosis is curable. Childbirth, while still carrying risks, doesn't kill women at the rates it once did. Infant mortality has dropped dramatically. You can reasonably expect to watch your children grow up. You have the right to vote regardless of your wealth, gender, or skin color. It took decades of fighting against the powerful to win that right, but it exists. Your vote counts the same as a billionaire's vote, at least on paper. The powerful can't quite as easily just buy elections outright, though they certainly try. You can change jobs. You're not trapped in debt bondage to a company store. You can leave an abusive employer without being blacklisted from an entire industry. You have some ability to negotiate, to organize with other workers, to push back against exploitation without facing immediate violence. You have access to information. The powerful can't completely control what you know anymore. You can research labor history, read about corporate abuses, organize with others online. Knowledge isn't locked behind expensive education available only to the elite. Food doesn't dominate your existence the way it did for working people in early California. You probably eat today, maybe not as well as you'd like, maybe not as healthy as ideal, but you ate. You'll eat tomorrow. You're not wondering if your children will have food. Hunger isn't your constant companion. Your housing, even if it's not great, is probably weatherproof. You have running water. You have a toilet. You have electricity. These seem basic, but they represent a quality of life that early California's working poor couldn't imagine. You come home exhausted from work, but at least you're coming home to actual shelter. You have legal recourse. If you're assaulted, there's at least a possibility of justice. If you're discriminated against, you can file complaints. If your employer cheats you, you can sue. These systems are far from perfect, but they exist. Working people in early California had no realistic path to justice against the powerful. Your children go to school. It's required by law. They're not allowed to work full-time. Whatever the quality of their education, they have access to it. The powerful can't simply reserve education for themselves while sending your children to work. You can imagine a better future. That might be the biggest difference. Working people in early California's worst decades learned not to hope. They learned that the system existed to grind them down, and dreaming of something better just made the reality hurt more. You can still imagine change, organize for improvement, and believe that progress is possible. None of this happened because the powerful became generous. Every single protection you have now was won through decades of organizing, striking, suffering, and fighting against people who wanted to maintain the exact system we've been describing. Every labor law, every safety regulation, every civil right was opposed by the powerful at every step. So let's come back to where we started. Early California was a playground for the powerful. We've proven that title wasn't exaggeration. The evidence is overwhelming. A handful of families and corporations owned the land, controlled the resources, purchased the government, and built their empires on the backs of people they considered expendable. They didn't just happen to be wealthier than everyone else. They systematically exploited working people, immigrants, women, and children to extract maximum profit while providing minimum survival. This wasn't normal hardship. This was everyone struggling together through tough times. This was designed exploitation. The powerful knew exactly what they were doing. They wrote laws to protect themselves and exclude others. They used violence when laws weren't enough. They corrupted courts, bought politicians, and crushed any resistance to their control. And they got away with it for decades because they could. Because they had the power and you didn't. Because California was their playground, and everyone else was just there to serve their interests or get destroyed trying to resist. Understanding this history matters because the impulse toward concentrated power never disappeared. The tactics have become more sophisticated, the exploitation more subtle, but the fundamental dynamic, the powerful seeking to rig the system in their favor, remains. Knowing how bad it once was, how completely they dominated, helps you recognize when similar patterns emerge. You owe your current rights and protections to people who refused to accept that the powerful were untouchable. People who organized despite blacklisting, who struck despite violence, who fought legal battles they usually lost but occasionally won. Change came slowly, painfully, at enormous cost, but it came because people demanded it. Early California's working poor didn't live in misery because they were weak or unlucky. They suffered because the system was designed to benefit the powerful at everyone else's expense. And that system only changed when people collectively forced change against overwhelming resistance. If this documentary opened your eyes to how recently our ancestors lived under conditions we'd consider intolerable, share it. The more people understand this history, the harder it becomes to repeat it. And if you want to understand how this pattern played out in other states, because California wasn't unique in this dynamic, check out the rest of this documentary series. Every state has its own story of power, exploitation, and eventually reform. Thanks for watching. Remember where we came from. Remember what it cost to get here. And never forget that the rights and protections you have now only exist because people refuse to accept that the powerful should control everything.